Four things in the speech. First, why do we have recession? Second, why we are now in our paradigm in the best place to be able to solve the recession. Third is how we think that a better discussion in terms of the general election will always lead to better policy change and being able to tackle the reasons for said recession. And the fourth is why all of the arguments that Bench can bring in terms of, oh, we'll elect Nazis are fallacious in the 21st century. The first argument, right? Why do we think, what are the causes of this recession? We think that there can be a global slowdown, or there can be unsound financial policy or reckless spending in terms of the United States going ahead and waging a war in Iraq, or like just like letting corporations get away with building the housing bubble, things like that, things that aren't out into the open, things that the public doesn't know and the public doesn't seem to care literally because they're not told by the news media. In our context, we think that this information is going to be free flowing because it's starting affecting people and every single individual in society. When I don't have a job, when I don't have housing, when the bond market has collapsed and the government can't have public confidence anymore, the insurance market seems to collapse where people can't get health insurance or life insurance. These are all things that start to affect purchasing power and things that eventually lead to a cycle of low economic stimulation where people don't have money, they can't spend money, that means other people can't make money. I'll take you in a couple of minutes. It's particularly important to understand that these happen because one particular form of government, like the right wing or the left wing, can dominate economic policy and social policy to a point where there isn't much debate as to how to deal with the recession or what kind of policies are acceptable or not, and it leads to a very, very singular way of dealing with a particular problem, which means that there's not much debate. If financial institutions, political institutions seem to be dominated by only one kind of party, only one kind of ideology that keeps pushing political paradigms into one particular side. I'll take you in a couple of minutes. Now, it's very, very important for you to understand that people will want change in these paradigms, and the government that is elected right now will obviously lose to a very large extent public confidence. And why we think that this general election is extremely, extremely important. We think that when a government leads you into a recession, not only are the leaders undermined, the leaders' capacity to sort of negotiate on an international level is also significantly undermined. Where if you want certain international financial aid or your ability to seek a bailout from the IMF or from the World Bank, all of your negotiating position like obviously depends on how much public confidence you have within your own country, and you need to make sure you have the mandate of the people, like Imran Khan did for Pakistan right now, like Barack Obama did in 2008, and like other leaders like Alex Tsipras in Greece have had right after a general election. Because when financial institutions are going to come and help you stimulate your economy again, they're going to require you to make certain promises, and the only way they're going to have faith in you or we even understand that you're going to be able to follow through on your promises is only and only when you have certain public confidence. You can show that I have 300 seats in my parliament, and that is the reason I will be able to push for financial reform. Because we've seen that in a lot of cases, things like unsound welfare policies, like in Greece, cause these recessions, which means that a large scale policy change is required in terms of being able to come out of these recessions. The cause necessarily does not go away if you keep continuing with the same political framework, which needs to be changed. Now, we think that whenever there's a general election, there will be a lot of discussion as to policy, as to how this can be solved, and that is going to happen in a space where there's not much informational asymmetry. So any argument with respect to, oh, people will elect a Nazi or people will elect somebody who is like unsound, like a Bolsonaro, it necessarily doesn't happen, because in times of recession, obviously the public is going to be so much more involved in this election because they've lost jobs, right? Like literally characterization of how a recession works. People don't have money to spend because they don't have jobs, and because people aren't spending any money, other people are also not able to get these jobs, which means that I'll take you in a minute. It's particularly important for you to understand that because of having an invested stake in getting myself a job or my family a job, I will necessarily always be involved in this general election, which is why we feel that popular participation in this election is going to lead to a lot of constructive change. I'll take opening.
Do you think people might ignore the social mandate in favor of the economic mandate?
We think it's possible, but it's not like you can push like the burden on us to defend, say, a Nazi, right? Because we don't think that in the 21st century, after having 200 years of dealing with parties that constantly keep pushing a very, very exclusionary social agenda, democracies are inherently going to opt for these despots, because if that's the burden they're taking upon them, they need to prove why, for all the benefits that we're coming and showing you, we will always elect a despot, because we think that in the 21st century, in all democratic states, it's particularly unlikely that this will happen. And even if it does, we think that these are elections which inherently, obviously, will become single issue elections. Even if they come and tell us that, oh, we might elect a despot, we think that in a particular context where you've led a country into a financial, like fuck up, or basically leading them to a situation where the economy can't be stimulated anymore, that leader itself is a despot, right? Show me why that context of being deprived of my basic economic rights is worse than on any context that you can show us on that side. I won't take another one. Now, it's also particularly important for us to understand that a large scale policy change in terms of maybe getting rid to a large extent of the welfare state as it exists, or maybe stimulating the economy, can only come when very courageous political decisions can be taken, and they need to come and show us a framework why, without a general election, without renewed public confidence, a new government can now make this happen. Because we think that in terms of change, in terms of reforming the welfare state, or looking towards increased government spending, or maybe raising money through an international bailout, are all things that aren't necessarily possible if you keep continuing with the same government that doesn't seem to function, that has unsound financial planning and unsound financial policies. Which is why we think that when the public in all of these countries does seek this change, they should be allowed to be able to vote on what party they necessarily want, literally, because that economic meltdown is going to get worse if we keep continuing with the same policy. We think that we show you a much better framework in being able to deal with these problems, and we don't buy their narrative of, in the 21st century, people will immediately ignore any socially, like, incredibly devious policy that you have in terms of social exclusion, because we don't think that those actors will even be considered legitimate in terms of their economic policy. It's also particularly important for you to understand that they have a huge burden in this debate to show us why any meaningful change will be backed by the public, because this incumbent government has necessarily lost public confidence. Show us why there will be international backing to an actor that does not have public support, or cannot make promises for his country, literally because you don't seem to have public confidence. Very practical. Oh.
Mr. Speaker, before I begin, we'd like to directly engage with them on this contextualization of a financial recession, right? We'd like to distinguish a financial recession from an economic crisis, right? The simple distinction being that the leader is not a despot that has led this country into the fuck up, right? On the contrary, a financial recession is cyclical, right? It literally is a sine curve which comes and goes, right? Accordingly, we counter with them on this contextualization, right? And we think this entire contextualization is very problematic and they frame the debate very badly, right? Now, moving on to our constructives, we have 4 constructives, right? First is that we believe this policy will not help the country get out of the recession, and that's naturally bad. Second, we tell you that during a recession, people are more likely to go by the economic mandate and neglect the social mandate, and why that's bad for the most marginalized people. Third, we're going to tell you how the government is in any case likely to not only pander to its vote bank, but also pander to industry and corporations, which in itself is a tangible harm, right? Now, on to our first constructive of why getting out of a recession will not happen, right? Mr. Speaker, as we've already told you, it's a cyclical event, and during the cyclical event, there are two things that governments can do to get out of a recession, right? First is monetary policy, second is fiscal policy. I'm first going to tell you why monetary policy is not as effective during a recession, which is very simple, right? Monetary policy, which is executed through the central bank, is contingent on the effectiveness of the financial institutions and the banks through which this policy is executed, right? Now, at the point at which these financial institutions have crashed, we tell you that the ability to effectuate meaningful change through monetary policy is done away with, right? Accordingly, in such contextualization, the only way to get out of this recession is through fiscal stimulus, right? Things like care packages, things like stimulus packages, things like tax breaks and subsidies, right? Now, let's understand what is needed by the government in order to bring about such fiscal stimulus, right? Two things are needed, right? One is they need extensive research, right? Standing committees need to be constituted that need to research what the problem is and what the solutions are, right? These standing committees are constituted by members of parliament who during a general election simply do not have the time, right? Second, what is need to be done, right? Governments need to get these packages passed, right? We tell you that in this context of a financial recession, the opposition is simply more likely to oppose these packages, and accordingly, there is no scope for fiscal stimulus in itself, right? Accordingly, we tell you that when we do not have to worry about a general election, there is more likely to be fiscal stimulus, right? Now, let's understand why this fiscal stimulus will not come about right before a general election, right? Because during a general election, the government's first priority is to get re-elected, right? In order to get re-elected, it spends most of its resources on rallies, right? On television, on news, right? In developing countries, parties literally go to villages and distribute cash and alcohol, right? This takes a huge drain on their financial reserves and on their mind space and on their time, and accordingly, they're not able to bring about fiscal stimulus, right? Now let's meet opening government on that very own metric, right? Even if they want to stop the crisis, we do not see how this policy stops the crisis, because the general election takes time, right? It literally takes like months to a year. Once the general election ends, the government literally needs to settle in, right? We tell you that all this time is simply going to worsen the financial crisis, and during this time, no action will be taken, Mr. Speaker. Thus, the the recession will simply become much worse, right? Accordingly, we win on this metric, right? Moving on to our second constructive, we tell you that, I'll take you in the fifth minute. We tell you that during a recession, people are more likely to view the government by its economic mandate and not its social mandate, right? Why? Simple, basic principle, right? That is Maslow's hierarchy. What does that mean? That means you will prioritize what you need the most, right? Accordingly, we tell you that in a situation where people are going through a financial recession and they need money so much that as long as the government simply makes promises to them, they are going to cling on to these promises and deprioritize their social mandate, right? Now, let's again understand the context in which these promises are made, Mr. Speaker. It is an outstanding fact that most promises made during an election are mere puffery and that they will never actually materialize, right? And we tell you that this is further problematic in light of how citizens are simply uninformed, right? They do not know what a good economic decision is and what a bad economic decision is, right? Now, why is the deprioritization of this social mandate so terrible, right? We tell you it's terrible because those who are economically marginalized and those who are most targeted by this financial recession are anyways those who are the most socially marginalized, right? These people are then forced to take a decision, right? Do I prioritize my economic mandate and put food on the table for my son to eat, or do I prioritize my social mandate and look out for my son and my grandchildren 10 years in the future, right? We tell you that even if the government tells them that economic benefit will bring about social change, this will never happen because social biases are entrenched and social biases dictate the creation of wealth, right? Meaning to say, until these social biases are gone away, no real economic benefit will truly perpetuate down to these people, right? And in any case, we tell you that even if the government does not, now let's look at we've told you that the government may prioritize its economic mandate. Let's look at a context where the government realizes that it does not have a good economic mandate and it chooses not to prioritize it, right? We tell you that in such instance, the government is going to choose a nationalist mandate, right? They come here and tell you we can't run that. We do not understand why, right? Hitler may be an outdated example, but we've literally seen the same thing happen in India, right? When Modi realized that his economic policies were not working, he prioritized his nationalist mandate, right? In this context, people chose to cling on to that nationalist identity, which was close to them and which was accessible to them, rather than an economic mandate, which was far away from them, right? Accordingly, we tell you that in such a situation, it just leads to a terrible democracy where people are just left worse off, right? Quickly, before I move on, I'll take a POI from closing.
So if you say that crises follow a cyclical pattern. Surely you don't need research time during a recession to fix the problem. You can predict this in advance and done the research beforehand.
So your POI presupposes that every recession is the exact same, that there are no differences between the causative factors, between the way the market is working. So that does not make sense. Literally, recession 20 years back is different from a recession now because of automation, because of technology. So yes, research is necessary. Ridiculous POI, right? Moving on to our last constructive about how the government is likely to prioritize policies that pander to their vote bank and pander to corporations and industries, right? Two paradigms, Mr. Speaker. First, we tell you that during a recession, everyone suffers, right? Since everyone suffers, even the people at the top, even the privileged who are in the government's pockets are going to go to the government and lobby the government for policies in their favor, right? They're going to tell the government that unless you give us the policies that we want, we are going to screw you over and vote for your opposition, right? In such a contextualization, we tell you that the government is simply going to focus all its packages towards its vote bank, right? We tell you that stimulus packages and care packages will be concentrated in those areas, in those regions where the government has their vote bank resident, right? And even though a recession affects everyone, we tell you that it affects some people disproportionately, right? And those who it affects disproportionately are now being further marginalized because the government is not prioritizing their mandate, right? Moreover, Mr. Speaker, let's understand that in most countries, elections are funded by corporate houses, right? Governments need corporate houses, government need these industries to fund them, right? Again, in this contextualization, what has happened to these corporations, right? In the present context, these corporations are down. They do not have money. They need to be bailed out by the government. Accordingly, the government is going to prioritize bailing out these corporations over helping minorities, and thus we think this is absolutely terrible. For all these reasons, we're proud to oppose.
Excellent. Now to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue today's debate.
Yeah, I'm aware. Okay, Alan, ready? Opening opposition falls out as debate when their only actual claim is that democracy is flawed and status quo. The way democracies work right now and politics works right now is a problem. We don't think it's a mutually exclusive problem in all of the arguments they're talking about. And in terms of research committees, I don't think that's a big harm. I'll deal with that in this speech. But at that point in which they can't show you any tangible problems with the general election existing, when they don't challenge us on how we can solve these recessions without ever giving you an alternative of how you're going to solve it, except, oh, we'll research right now, or oh, people won't care because they won't have time because they're distributing alcohol on the streets right now. So we don't understand at that point when they don't give you an alternative to solve this recession, we think we automatically take that claim. But I'll deal with all your argumentation with positive material and tell you why in the negative case they're running can't exist in this debate and why they follow. Three things in this speech. First, I'm going to talk about what the nature of a recession is because we don't think it's a cyclical problem that, oh my God, everything's unique. But second, we're going to talk about why general elections are the best way to solve this. Third, on a comparative, I'm going to tell you why we clearly take this debate. But before that, let's deal with all the material. First, the biggest harm is that, oh, listen, we're going to have a Nazi Germany again because Hitler is going to come about and a new party and a new candidate is going to stand and tell you, oh, listen, we're going to fuck you over right now. But understand two things right now. First, they need to show you a link between why you have to make this choice between a social mandate and an economic mandate. We don't think parties are going to solely argue on the basis of an economic mandate and at that point in time socially exclude you in terms of taking away your rights without ever telling you why this is a binary and alternative choice that you need to make or why this is an either or choice you need to make. They never tell you why it is always a choice between my right to live and the food I get on my plate right now. At that point when they can't show you that this is an either or situation, we don't think that argument can stand in that situation. But secondly, we think there are checks and balances that didn't exist back when Nazi Germany existed. We think the courts are a lot more proactive right now. We think there are NGOs right now that go ahead and check the government when they go ahead and make undemocratic decisions. So we think minority communities are getting more rights because people are there to talk for them, right? We don't think back then there were people to check Hitler because he had the ability to go in and control narratives. We think at this point in time when there are so many people that are ready to fight, we don't think why this is going to happen. But the argument is, listen, the only way you can go ahead and stop recessions if you have research committees. But understand why this challenge doesn't actually defeat our claim of why the public and politics is not working right now. Understand the nature of a recession, right? We think at that point when a single
singular ideological policy is implemented by this ruling party right now, we think recession continues to happen because there's no discussion with regards to opposition parties. Opposition parties are blocked out of debate because the ruling party says, hey, listen, we know what's best right now and we will continue with the policies we want to go ahead and do. But we think general elections give you a particularly unique situation where opposition parties have the ability to enter this discussion and enter this debate. We think the comparative is this. We think research committees are always going to exist in terms of experts sitting in Harvard and Oxford and discussing how to solve the recession. But we think the point at which you involve the public is when you make it a stake to them as well. At that point, when you make it a general election, when people care about why they're making this vote right now, and we think people are going to go to that polling booth because it's affecting them directly, right? We think the difference is simply that when normal general election happens, we don't think you face the brunt of it directly at that point. And we think the urgency here is that right now I've lost my job, I don't have food to feed my family with. At that point, I want to go ahead and make a better change, and I will go ahead and engage in this debate right now because I want to make the best choice for me. But let's deal with welfare and freebies, right? Because I tell you, listen, we're going to give everything away right now, but understand uniquely why we are in this recession. For example, Greece exists in a recession right now and existed because they kept taking bailouts, right? We think the people are aware of the fact the reason why you exist in this recession is because you've gone ahead and made short-term benefits in order for a long-term cost as a trade-off. We think at that point when people recognize that short-term benefits are not working right now and need a long-term benefit and a long-term policy to go ahead and solve the problem, we don't understand why you're going to pick that freebie right now and support that government to go ahead and do so. But they need to also engage why opposition parties can't just simply challenge you in terms of policy, right? Because they have the best ability to do so in undermining you right now. You are the reason why you're in this recession. They can't tell you that, oh, listen, the stock market crash, that's why we're in this recession. We also think it's because you haven't made a better policy or changed your policy to go ahead and get yourself out of this recession. When they come and tell you fiscal policies are the best way to do so. We think at that point when they undermine their entire case, the argument is we don't think it works. But understand this, even Modi, when he came to power, still exists in power. We think it's not particularly exclusive for them to say, oh, these people are only going to get elected because of a recession. We still think he got re-elected. But irrespective in that case, we don't understand why recessions don't have an impact post a period of time when the general election happens next. Why do we think this is particularly problematic when you hold a general election during a recession? Right? Even 5 years down the line, after a new general election is happening, we still think political parties can talk about how a recession happened and the consequences of that recession. We don't think immediacy exists as a problem in terms of recession. At that point, when you hold an election during a recession, that's the debate they need to have, not in terms of, oh, they can manipulate it during using a recession. But it's real positive material you get from OG, which still stands at the end of my speech. First, we think discussion about policy improves us vastly. 2 reasons why. First, we think you involve people about these discussions versus not having this discussion at all. But I'll deal with that later because I think that's enough substantive material in the buttons. But let's deal with a particularly unique benefit you get from OG. Why do we think international organizations give you bailouts and give you loans as the World Bank, as the IMF? We think 2 things. One, you have the general mandate of the people. The fact that the people trust you enough to vote you into power right now necessarily means that there is confidence within your country that you are the best poised party to go ahead and rule that country in terms of economic policy. But secondly, understand why this is especially important during a recession. Why do we think you get bargaining power when your ability to stand in an election and win right now works? 2 things. Why? First, we think you can make legitimate promises in terms of actual policy goals because you have not elected 5 years down the line, or you will not be elected 2 years down the line when another election happens, but you've been elected right now. Meaning, the ability for them to check you right now in terms of you existing in power exists a lot more in our world compared to theirs because the recession has happened right now and the election has happened right now. You show the ability for me to handle in a situation of crisis right now in terms of economics is possibly probable because of the fact that I've been elected, because the people trust me in terms of policy and I've just been elected. Meaning people are a lot more confident in giving you those loans and giving you those bailouts because of 2 reasons. One, the people trust you in order to elect you to power and get them out of this recession. But secondly, understand that the people are going to exist for a period of time, meaning you can go ahead and hold them liable. Closing if you have a question. I'll take it in opening. Cool. But let's deal with this, right? Why do we think discussion is a lot better and policies are a lot better on our side? Check 2 reasons why. First, understand all of these narratives and all of these blocking out of parties exist on both sides of the house right now. In status quo, when there are no elections, right? What do we think gives you a unique situation when an election happens? 2 things. One, opposition parties have the ability to go ahead and bring about discussion with regards to challenging the government to do so. Why do we think that's the case? Because ruling parties also need to defend their claims right now. They can't just go ahead and say, oh, listen, our policy is absolutely brilliant just because it exists, because now they have an actual tangible challenge and an actual tangible threat of losing an election and losing the power to go ahead and rule the country. This necessarily means 2 things can happen. One, they have to go ahead and moderate their policy in terms of making it better, in terms of not being as hardcore as it is right now. But secondly, and we think the more probable situation is that they're going to make a lot more drastic changes than they would have made right now. I think both halves agree to the extent where you need to solve a recession, you need drastic changes. But we don't think that's happening in status quo because there is no challenge that exists with regards to threats that happen in terms of your power, in terms of oppositions making you debate these policies. But we think when a general election happens, you need to go ahead and make these drastic changes in order to get to power, because you need to tell the people that I can get you out of the recession through these particular drastic changes, which can't happen in status quo because you have the confidence of having that particular seat right now. But why do we think Bench needs to answer a few questions, especially in CO, because OO is out? First, what are the reasons why we have not left this state of recession right now? That's something they need to deal with in terms of telling you why policies are not working right now. But second, you need to talk about why do we need in this particular state? What kind of policies do you need to go ahead and actuate in this state? Why that can happen in this state? Third, you need to answer the question of why is it better on Op Bench's side when there's no election? We think the point at which you have an election, you bring about the confidence of the people down. You give them more faith if they win this election. And at that point in time when they want to win this election, they have better changes. Very, very slow.
Let's first look at side opening government. First, they say that public confidence is important and it's important to repose this kind of public confidence in the middle of a recession. We think that the government already has some public confidence, which is why it's in power in the first place. They haven't given us any reason why the natural course of election shouldn't be the barometer as to why we need to have an election immediately at this particular point in time when 2 years later there may be just another recession election in the first place, right? They say that the government has no challenge to its part. Of course it does. It's not like the government is in power forever. It also realizes that at any point in time, if it doesn't do drastic change, if it doesn't change the state of affairs for the people, 2 years later, if not now, it's going to be gone out of power, right? The alternative to solve that recession on our side of the house is simply to give them those 2 or 3 years more, of like consolidated time in government in order to research, do all of those things that Viraj has spoken to you about to solve that recession. Which means that the problem is therefore that an election reduces this kind of stability. Why? Because of two reasons. First, that like the time on the resources of the government are literally going to be focused solely on that election, because election is an existential threat to the government in the first place, which means that the first priority of that government at that point in time is always to use that money in rallies, use their time in rallies, use their time in propaganda and so many other things, which means that in their best case, after 1 or 2 years, if the opposition government even ends up coming into power, during that time period, the recession has gotten so much worse because the government hasn't been able to make decisions because it's been focused solely on that recession that the people have suffered, plus it's much, much, much harder now in order to get out of that recession in the first place. Then they say that opposition parties don't have any kind of checks on the government. No, parliament is an important check. They can filibuster, they can block bills in the parliament, they can turn public confidence against the government if the government really has poor policies by chastising them on media, chastising them on television. In the first place, we don't see this characterization of how opposition parties only come into light when there is an election going on. We think oppositions are, of course, like a major part of the democratic process, were always visible throughout the process, and there are too many avenues that are available for the oppositions to be visible. But even in their worst case, we don't, if the large number of elected government can get bills passed, we don't think that that's an intrinsic problem, because those people are elected to make those decisions in the first place. We think that like at the point in time where we've shown you that that government has a relevant incentive structure in terms of like retaining its power 2 years down the line in the next general election, it has that incentive to appeal to its people in the first place, right? Then they say, no, you need to involve people directly in these decisions. We disagree with that. We think that quite often ordinary people make decisions based on their own myopic self-interest. We think that governments, in order when they're like, or states, when they have to take care of different disparate interests at different points in time, must make technocratic decisions, especially at like times where technocratic decisions are required, such as financial recessions. These may involve problematic concessions which may not be palatable to some people at that particular point in time, but are there for the greater good. We think that at the point in time where a government has an immediate existential threat, where they don't have the opportunity of making those trade-offs, they're necessarily going to make rash decisions, which as I'm going to show you later in my speech. Then they say, oh no, you're not going to get loans, you're not going to get international support. Understand that like
those loans are not based on public confidence at any point in time. They're based on the propensity of you getting that money back, because like no international institution like the IMF is going to give you a loan simply because you're an elected government. The fact, like, it's the loans are completely separate from this debate. Loans have to do entirely with how much money, or for the propensity in that economy of you getting that money back. We don't really see what they're saying at this point in time, right? Two more things in my speech. Why? There is greater propensity for rash decision making by the government or like by the opposition parties. And second, why there's greater propensity for people to ignore the social mandate, and why this, like, having an election at this point leaves them more vulnerable to things like nationalism. First, the government now has an immediate existential threat, which means it needs to consolidate its voter banks, which means that the possibility of going out of power means that in areas where the social voter bank is concentrated is the one where they're going to dedicate most of their stimulus packages. These are often like areas where they're like ethnic or social majorities that the vote for the government are concentrated, which means that at the time of recession, of an election, the last entity that they need to care about is minorities. That's particularly horrible, considering that because of social factors, these minorities are often the worst ones who are affected as a result of that recession, which means, and they say that no one is going to do that because, like, no, we can't have Nazi Germany anymore. Understand that these things are not so explicit, but they happen insidiously anyway, which means that at the point in time where they can just dedicate resources like in a disproportionate manner without individuals even realizing that that thing has been done, because government policies are often quite opaque, don't reach people on the ground, like, because they don't have the relevant economic know-how in order to process all of these things. We think that the government often has, and people in the majority are happy because they're getting that money, like, that is devoid from the minorities who anyway don't have that kind of voting power to elect that government. We think that those kinds of things are more likely to happen. Next, they say that, like, next we say that those governments are also more likely to give money to corporates and banks in this scenario. We think that at the point in time where corporates and banks now have a personal stake in deciding the outcome of that election, because the winner of that election decides who gives them the care packages, because these are the entities who are mostly suffering during the time of elections, they're most likely to hedge their bets on the party that is going to get them, like, the biggest care packages, biggest stimulus packages, biggest bailouts at that point in time, which means that both parties, be it the opposition or the government, now have a clear incentive of pandering to these corporates, pandering to these banks, taking money from these banks in order to get policies passed in their favor. That's absolutely horrible, because that money needs to go into public services, which is the first thing that are cut at the time of a financial recession, which means that at the point in time where a government can tell you that we're cutting money from public services because we're going through a recession, and then has an incentive of using that money to bail out government, bail out corporates, bail out banks, because they consider them important for wealth creation. For example, what happened in America, we think that it's more likely for them to, like, ignore important things and focus of that, right? That is why there's greater propensity for people to ignore the social mandate in this scenario. We think that at the point in time of a recession where people are economically very poor, they're most vulnerable to nationalism. Why? Because it's most accessible at that point in time, right? They're national and nothing is working out for them, which means that it's something for them to cling on, is their national identity, which means that at the point in time where parties thrive on this kind of thing, for example, Bolsonaro, who chastises the existing government for its liberal policies, draws false equivalencies between, like, stimulus packages or care packages or affirmative action given to minorities as a reason for why the economy is in a slowdown in the first place. The people are more likely to be in a position where, like, they're more likely to agree with that kind of message and understand that, or, like, believe those false equivalencies simply because of the fact that they don't have any food on the table, which means that at the point in time where they offer them greater freebies to these particular people at the cost of those people who need those freebies the most, they're going to agree and going to be more vulnerable to those kinds of things. So what have we told you so far? We've told you that, like, public confidence is anywhere there with the government. You can give them 2 more years, but financial recessions require stability, and elections deprive them of the stability, greater propensity for rash decision making by the government, and greater propensity for people to ignore the social mandate.
It would now invite the government member to make the opening up, reporting up today.
I'm surprised no team in this room has talked about principles so far, because when economic outcomes are uncertain, we have to revert to things that break the deadlock in terms of practical outcomes. We decide that maybe that the right to be able to decide, the right to be able to face that uncertainty head on the part of the electoral populace should take precedence over speculation as to whether your policies will work out or not. There are three reasons why principles are particularly important. The first is that we don't currently know what the people want. So when they say, for example, in opening opposition, economic issues may, the population may emphasize economic issues over social issues, for example, and then they say that may be a bad thing, and then may result in people or governments neglecting to take care of social issues and to take care of minorities as a result. I have a few responses to that. For the poor or for minorities in various countries, who are often economically disenfranchised, whose lives are most precarious economically, who stand to risk their jobs and livelihoods in the case of a recession if the government doesn't do anything. Maybe they do care about economic preferences more than their social ones, and you don't know that for certain. Maybe everyone in the country cares about economic preferences, in which case, then perhaps, principally speaking, it is the duty of the government to seek a mandate when a recession happens in order to ensure that you know exactly what the people want. No, thank you. And you can't predict, right, what people actually want. A lot of political polls are often poor in predicting the outcomes of elections or what politicians or what the population cares about, because otherwise Bill Shorten would have been in power by now, but nope, that didn't happen. And in response, I think, to the whole point about minorities, the first thing I'd like to say is, like, they claim that the policy is going to be worse on our side because now minorities are going to be further excluded from elections. But that assumes that the incumbent government was a good one in the first place and cared about minorities. Oh no, Modi's going to be re-elected. He was so nice to minorities the previous time. What will happen now? Like, this fucking nonsense is one. Secondly, and more importantly, their arguments and examples are generic, right? Bolsonaro was elected despite the fact that Brazil did not go through a recession. Modi has been re-elected for a second term despite the fact that India has not gone through a recession. Clearly, their arguments and their examples and all the nationalist tendencies that they fear are things that exist in any electoral cycle, the implication of which is, are you prepared to defend not having elections whatsoever? If you're not, where is the appropriate threshold, right? Because otherwise, any standard that you claim is an arbitrary one. Our standard is very simple. When the times are tough and when the scale of the harm may potentially be great and when there is great uncertainty as to what policies will actually get you out of the situation, you ought to have additional fresh elections. No, thank you. Next principle. Why is it important? Because what will the citizenry sacrifice? Because you don't get a consent, right? In many instances, sure, citizens already sacrifice a lot. But I think when the scale of the problem is great, such that you demand even greater sacrifice out of the citizenry, there is an intuitive reason as to why you ought to get the consent before you visit huge restrictions on freedom and property upon them. So, for example, when you say, I'm going to loosen the labor law so that you no longer have wage protections, the companies make it easier to fire your citizenry from their jobs because you need to remain competitive in a recession. When, for example, you want to increase taxation in order to finance additional public spending to stimulate the economy, or conversely, when you want to increase debt without raising taxes and you impose obligations on future generations, when you want to devalue your currency to make your exports competitive, but that means your savings go up, or when for austerity periods and you want to cut public spending, conversely, there are a variety of economic responses, all of which are extremely onerous upon the citizenry. And we have precedent for that, right? When times are particularly tough, when particularly momentous decisions have to be made, we go through referendums, right? Rather than suspending parliament and getting the rest of the country really, really, really angry. Or we hold snap elections. But there are incentives for why governments in the status quo don't want to hold snap elections during recessions. If they don't, we force them to. The third reason why I think principles are particularly important is because there is no guarantee that the government of the day, the status quo, the incumbent government, was qualified in the first place to bring us through a recession, either because they fucked up prior or because they're going to fuck up in the future during the 1 or 2 years after the recession first begins. So recessions are massive, right? And the reason why they're massive is because India in a bad economic year, it does not go through a recession. Maybe growth is 4%, 5%. For Malaysia, 3%. Right? For Singapore, 0.5%. Even in times where finances are lean, those are not considered recessions. So when a recession actually happens in these countries, it's really, really bad and really, really rare. And they're not just cyclical. The reason why I give the POI, if it sounds ridiculous, is because the premise that I borrowed from O is ridiculous. They're not like earthquakes. You can't just say, oh no, these things happen. You can't just you just have to deal with it. No, the reality is that sometimes they happen every 10 years, sometimes they happen every 15 years. And the reason why is because somebody fucked up. And the extent is largely determined by your own government policy prior. Sure, the US may be in a recession. Sure, Thailand may have had a financial crisis and Malaysia and Singapore are affected. But the reality is some countries weather it far better than others. If your government of the day had decided to save on financial reserves instead of like stealing money from like government finances, or if you impose regulations or stress tests to ensure that your banks are not overly exposed to foreign banks who might suffer from recessions overseas, you will weather the recession or you will weather financial crises a lot better. And that means if a recession actually happens, you ought to be doubtful as to whether the government of the day actually took care of you. Maybe you're faultless as a government, but it's not likely. And even if it were more true than not that the government of the day was faultless, then the uncertainty means that we ought to revert to popular opinion and to decide for them, to let them decide for themselves whether the government of the day was good or not. Yes.
We limit the ability of people to vote for ministers or generals. We don't give them that ability, even though they make major decisions. What's so different between the major decision there and here?
No, but we do force like ministers to be elected before they can be appointed. And if you don't like those parties who appointed stupid ministers into power, then vote them out, right? That's the entire premise. Most importantly, they say, oh no, but our policy is going to create more bailouts and corporate fat cats are going to be rich. No, in the status, like, firstly, I think both parties are susceptible to it, but I think government parties are susceptible to it more. Why? Because in the status quo, they have everything to hide, right? They are the ones who are there in power because their cronies that funded their political campaigns, and there is a natural incentive for opposition parties to oppose anything the government says, according to their logic, including the status quo like ties between corporations and governments. The last thing I want to talk about is what happens to these governments in the future. Because they say, why now? Why not 2 years down the road? My response is simple. Because I don't trust your ability to come up with good policies like between now and 2 years down the road. Not all policies that governments come up with are good. For example, they say austerity when maybe the solution was not austerity but increased public spending. Maybe we should default on our debts when the rest of the world is just like, but no, then you lose the confidence of the international markets and you'll never be able to get FDI in order to stimulate your economy within the next few years. A lot of government policies in response to recessions are bunkum. And in order to be able to check these policy responses, you need to have the election now. For all those reasons, vote CG.
And welcome, Offenbach.
Stopwatch. The only reason why practical benefits seem so uncertain to closing government that they run a purely principle extension is because we think that the opening debate has focused on random characterizations of different policies and election dynamics. We would be the only team to show you theoretical and inherent characterizations of number one, what are policies that are required to actually get out of recession, which we think is the most important thing in this debate because we need to see how do we get out of particular recessions. Number two, what's the impact of election dynamics in failing to reach such policies? Number three, and we'll talk about structural economic implications of purely elected governments because there's a running assumption that the elected government would be better on the government side, and it's not like a single example like example of minority discrimination. So we would be more structural in explaining that. So first of all, let's talk about policies. The worst policy that you can have in terms of crisis in economy is to have a specific black and white policy positions. We think that we need to have compromise of complex and different policy positions. Let me picturize you with a very simple example of austerity versus stimulus, where the limit spending of governments or inject and more spendings on the stimulating local businesses, right? We think that in a condition of recession, we need to take the best of both worlds. We need to have austerity at the same time also have stimuluses. Why? Because different sectors have different importance and different sectors have different current budget efficiencies. You need to austerize some of them and you need to also stimulate some of them, right? Now, why do we think that on their side of the house, you cannot make these policy positions? Because of structural reasons of elections that make specific black and white policy positions. Number one, we think that in general, it's touched a bit, that you need simple and black and white policy positions society can easily understand. But number two, we think that it's also important to see that parties have interest to be opportunists and take as many seats as possible. We also think that parties have large insecurities in terms of losing seats in this particular case. So they want to be oppositional and specific and black and white in the policy because they want to win against the opposition, ladies and gentlemen. This is something that have not been touched but not structurally explained by OO. This is a good example in like Greece, in which change of leaders in that particular case actually led to facilitations of stimulus and outright opposition of austerity. Well, we actually can do both, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we think that there's another layer of important explanation that we only have. I'll take you later, which is that there is an existence of large political consultants with huge capital running elections across the world. We think that means that these kinds of problems is something that would definitely happen, because we have a trend where a lot of elections all over the world are being run by these particular consultants with the strategies of giving black and white policy positions, with strategies of nationalism and so on. So this is structural reasons that opening doesn't have. Now, what's the comparative on our world, right? Why in normal parliament dynamics we can still do this and we can have compromise? Because like they also have explanations about, well, this happens in any way. We agree that polarizations and oppositions exist in general in parliaments, but we also agree that there is also an ability for you to create small coalitions and concessions for future wins. This is like general political theory in which a lot of parties actually have. But these parties would only take these positions only when they are not in like dire threat, right? It will only make them when there is a long-term gain, right? The problem is, in a condition where you have snap elections at that point of time, it's very unlikely for you to make that long-term decisions, because there are a lot of insecurities and uncertainties on whether or not the coalitions would actually work, whether or not your opposition party would backstab you because they want to be opportunists in this case of crises, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we think that on our side of the house, it's more likely for these compromises and good policies to happen. But more on why, other than like in general being compromising, it also needs to be a good policy, right? Opening option mainly touched about time, but they didn't really talk about and analyze about what are the specific abilities that parties need to have to determine these policies. And we think that is the ability to hire the specific experts that are required. Why do we think that on our side of the house we create a better analysis on this? Because we think that in terms of trying to win in economic recessions, you need to have very good data analysis and very good economic analysis upon like the influxes of your economy, right? But the problem is, because you have limited capital, the analysts that you have are actually the same people that usually analyze economic analysis, but now they are forced to analyze like campaign statistics and political statistics, ladies and gentlemen. So this is like the specific characterizations that are needed to deal with economic recession. Now the same people are being used for elections, ladies and gentlemen. This is something that we don't want. Yes.
When political platforms will come up with economic policies on the basis of which the public will elect them, why won't that debate include all kinds of policies that will obviously be aimed at solving this recession?
Because of all the structural reasons why I already told you, why the climate of politics right now would only bandwagon on these particular issues rather than actually use them, because there's already predetermined, predetermined abilities of wanting to win, predetermined abilities of nationalism that we already explained structurally on our side of the house. But now, moving on to the second contribution on why we think that these have very bad implications when right now. First of all, we think that there is a high probability that the winning government, in terms of the climate right now, would be a power-hungry party. But the consequence is that they are more likely to make decisions that are very bad. Opposition touched a bit on this, but only talked about like minorities. Stop example of when prime ministers, for instance, also elected in these snap elections. We think that a lot of decisions which are bad in recessions are decisions that are made executively, right? Or like decisions made singularly by a leader, in this case, prime ministers, for instance. Or not only decisions that are made directly, but also things like replacing members of banks and courts, ladies and gentlemen. This is something that's bad because monetization and monetization really relies on like these government agencies like the central banks having like stability, but the stability can be encroached when you have more involvement of bad governments. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we also think about like different with the opening debate. We also agree with the government that investor confidence is important because it's not only about your ability to pay back, but a lot of times the most crucial is about creation of jobs, right? Creation of jobs needs a lot of initial capital in terms of business coming in rather than governments have to build the jobs themselves. It means that it's important for us to have investors actually opening businesses in your country, ladies and gentlemen. It's much more unlikely in their side of the house because even if economic recession is unstable in general, economic recession compared to combined with a polarized elections would be much, much worse on their side of the house. It means that you do not have the MNCs opening the quick jobs that can create, short-term solutions for these individuals, or even long-term when these businesses chooses to stay, ladies and gentlemen. What's the conclusion on our case? The only thing that shows you the specific policies that are necessary, why the elections actually are bad for that, and the implications of a poor government that they have never defended even once on their side of the house. We're very proud to oppose.
So welcome the government to close the government.
Let's first take CEO out of this debate. Reason number one, I think they don't adequately actually respond to parts of adult extension that are extremely important. It's not the fact that adult extension is purely principle, but adult actually explains that the practical consequences of a recession, i.e. the context that we're talking about, are due to principal failings of governments because they are not held accountable to the will of the people. I think this sort of framing is particularly important, and I think that's something that they refuse to respond to. But secondly, if you look at analyze their extension more closely, they seem to tell us that the extension seems to revolve around the fact that there's like mismanagement in the case where you don't have enough resources, for example, to analyze elections, and that a lot of political consultants exist, and therefore, since political climates are bad, we shouldn't have a general election. But here are a couple of responses, right? The second thing that Adil also says is that Adil tells you the problem and the reason why we need to have elections is because given the fact that governments or the incumbent ones control all the different structures of governments and had years from the time in which they were elected to the time where the recession happens to fix the country or at least to stabilize the country, means that there was massive fuck-ups that happened on multiple structures and levers of government. Specifically, we think having an election right now is important. So therefore, I don't think CO or even OO to that regard actually analyzes what situations led up to the financial recession, because they don't actually talk about those things, right? If you are allowing governments, a government 3 years to screw up your country, why would people trust that government, or give the government an additional 2 to 3 years to fix that country again if that trust has been broken? Those are reasons why, principally, we think people need to be able to decide on the fate of the economic country, and I don't think the extension necessarily gets at that. The second part of the extension I want to talk about, right, is this idea of, it's strange idea of somehow you suddenly run out of analysts because enough consultants won't want to work for you. One, they sort of conflate political consultants with economic consultants, and given that governments are large enough, they can hire consultants on a different level. But secondly, I think a fundamental part of any government is to have analysts on board. That's the third reason why I think CO falls out of this debate, and I think OO at large as well, is because the opposition broad framing, right, is that current political climates are bad because governments are able to misuse structures to their advantage. This is the general framing that all bench uses. But the problem with this kind of framing, and their arguments by extension, is that one, Adil tells you that this framing is not exclusive to this particular situation, but political climates in general. But secondly, and more importantly, and this is the extension of that response specifically from CG, is that if they claim that this is the problem, their solution, on the other hand, yet is to allow the same incumbent governments to continue to misuse these levels of power, to continue to misuse these structures, and to continue abusing the hell out of democratic systems in order to make sure that one, they stay in power, and two, they don't have to be held accountable to the people. So I think by their own sort of broad framing, right, they don't adequately explain why it is not why it's not okay to have an election right now, or why incumbent government should be allowed to determine or control the future of the country. Therefore, I think I have two broader things that I want to discuss in terms of issues. One, I want to talk about whether incumbent governments are necessarily qualified to handle the different aspects of a recession. And secondly, I'll engage with the parts of the debate that OG didn't really engage with, which is OO's best case of countries being thrown into populism, not Nazism, because I don't really think that's the debate. Okay, one, are incumbent governments necessarily qualified to handle recessions? Here's some stuff that we heard from OO, right? They kind of tell us that recession like cyclical, and the premise, like the arguments that comes out of this premise is that elections are cyclical, but at the same time you suddenly need like research committees because like government scholars are all like college students are like mugging at the last minute because clearly they didn't spend the last 5 years of the government like trying to like research on these things, or it wasn't their fucking job to know like predict economic trends anyway. If this claim is true that recessions are cyclical, it must also be like consequently true that you probably have a lot of years to sort of predict like economic forecasts and data analysis to try to see whether a government falls into election. This happens from the point at time in which a new government is elected, because that means the economic arm of the government or the central bank, for example, has years and lots of time to predict this. This means that if you fucked up to the point where a recession happened, it probably means that you weren't really that good at your job anyway, right? There's a kind of specific things that Adil mentions, which I don't think did adequately actually tackle. Secondly, what does this mean, right? This analysis therefore means that it's a massive red flag and red stain on the government. Why is this important? This is important because it affects the way in which people see their governments. In order for democratic processes to be upheld, and this is the part of the extension again that is important, people need to have the confidence in the government, and government need to be held accountable to the will of the people. Why is the will of the people important? Because in point of recession, you don't adequately or fully know what the people really want. That's why the deadlock in opening half is never really broken, because both sides sort of assert and say that people want this, no, people want that. We say people can want a mixture of both financial and social incentives, and therefore I think they need to be given a space to resolve those tensions. And the only way we can resolve those tensions in terms of finding out what the people want is holding an election, because principally, we think in a democratic situation where a financial recession takes place, people need to be able to determine or dictate and see whether the government still, like the people still trust the government. The third thing I want to respond to is that OO's case necessarily just makes arguments for why bad governments should handle recession, but it doesn't make arguments for why you should not have elections at all, right? Because if their claim is true that like we can have elections at any point in time, here's the harm, right? If they say have elections in 2 years, for example, and like not now, and the incumbent government stays in power, one, they can continue to use populist measures that they talk about, and two, within 2 years, for example, they can use other kinds of methods to deflect things away from the fact that economic crisis just happened 2 years ago. That is why we can't delay the vote, right? Because it gives the government ample amount of time to reframe the issue by the time the new election cycle happens, which is why something needs to happen right now at the point in time where people's consciousness are the most active and people are the most acutely affected. Because at the end of the day, even in principle, democratic governments are strengthened by the will of its people, and that's why I think it's extremely important. Second thing I want to necessarily talk about, okay, but before that, here's why this extension is necessarily important. But before that, yes.
Most recessions, by your own characterization, are caused by long-standing policies of previous governments. For example, Obama was handed over a country with a horrible economic system that capitulated 6 months after he took office. Would you hold a general election?
Yeah, as in, so like one, that's the singular characterization. Two, you haven't really told me there's a broad analysis. But three, as long as the government goes in fucking recession, we have an election. Okay. Why is like our extension important, right? Opening half deadlocks and not explaining whether people need a new policy or not. We told you that one, we don't know what people really want, therefore an election is important. Secondly, any government must obtain a vote of confidence, given that given the fact that creating a recession was a red flag in the first place. And thirdly, it's unclear from off bench why incumbents should be allowed to stay without any sort of consequences. Last thing I want to talk about in terms of populism, right? OG strawmans over by saying that we'll resolve Nazism, but I think they're really talking about populism. But here are the measures. One, for example, things like using national identity is more likely on their side of the house when incumbent governments can continue using those manifestations to ensure that they stay in power and say the economic issue is not really a result of us fucking up, but it's because of the West, for example, like creating all those consequences. Secondly, it also leads to incumbent governments continuing to use and rally on populism to generate like waves against being taken away from power. And thirdly, I think at the end of the day, right, if structures are poor, as long as you continue to allow bad governments to hold structures of power, I think that's when the greatest amount of damage happens. So even on the comparative, I think at the very least, holding an election is far more preferable. Very, very proud to propose.
Let's invite the opposition whip to conclude this debate.
I want to concede that the current government is not perfect. In fact, no government is ever perfect. Probably the current government are involved in the fuck-ups or they inherited from the previous administration. But the key question in this debate is whether an election will make things worse or whether an election will make things better. It's not that on whether the current government is good or bad. All right, so I want to talk about three things. Number one, I want to do a direct comparison with opening government on the people who will get elected at the end of the day, why it is something that's very uncertain compared to our more certain benefits if you continue with the current government. Secondly, I'm going to do a direct comparison with closing government on how will exactly people vote and why giving more choice is simply detrimental to solving the crisis. Third and finally, a direct comparison to our opening opposition as to why our material is much more important. Let's begin with the direct comparison with opening government. If you take a look at opening government and part of closing government's case, that's all based on creating better policy to counter the unsound financial decision or creating a better trust by the international organization by having these new people elected at the end of the day, right? But all this is reliant on one thing, that the new government that is elected is a much better government compared to the previous administration. And this is aligning in a bottle situation. It is a big assumption that no one in government bench ever proved that the new government will be a better one, right? What's the reality? The power that rises up can often be worse. Brazil, when it is hit by economic downturn, while it's not yet a full-blown recession, does not result with a rise of Lula da Silva nor the technocrat who run, but it is Jair Bolsonaro who rises up, whose solution is to distance himself from the international organization that OG want to cater and to distance himself from G7 and burn Amazon. In Greece, when Alexis Tsipras fall, it is the finance minister Yanis Varoufakis who actually understand the crisis and maintain things in order, who also get booted up by the new government. What does this show you? This shows you that the new government is not always perfect. This debate must therefore analyze the likelihood of the new government that is elected, right? The type of government that rises up. And the key question becomes our contribution on how will political party create their platform in a time of crisis and why this result in the much more dangerous government, right? Okay, what do we prove to you in our case? Number one, we prove to you that in a time of election, what this political party do is that they force themselves to be different. Because our important characterization is that oftentimes in order to solve a crisis, you need to be able to do both. You need to be able to get accesses and you need to think and see many school of thoughts together, right? In Greece, for example, some austerity might be necessary because they send 2% of their GDP to NATO, ladies and gentlemen, which at the time of crisis might not be that important. But at the same time, a stimulus is also important for Greece because their economy is very oligarchic in nature. But what's the problem? Inside of an election, parties like Syriza, for the purpose of being different, for the purpose of being consistent and also recognizable, force themselves to pick one school of thought, i.e. they become anti-austerity and they become full-on stimulus. Now, why is it that this is inherent and why can't parties just do both? Because if they do that, societies will be confused as to what the party wants. It will be too complex and it will not be catchy. They will not have a clear identity. It's recognizable and memorable, right? And this is where our talk about political analysts comes in, because this is what the political analysts thought on the politician, that they need to focus on that one clear identity, and that's why they will not consider multiple school of thoughts, but only focus on one. Secondly, what does political party do in a time of election? Showmanship. Being anti-compromise, ladies and gentlemen. Because what needs to happen under a parliament meeting, if you want to fight against a crisis, is that you need to consider the possibility of compromising. What are we talking about? We're talking about allowing you giving votes to the other party as well, so that a policy can pass. For example, on whether or not the Trouble as Relief program that's created by Obama should be passed at the end of the day. Republicans should have decided to agree with it, right? But they don't. They attempted to do a filibuster to the extent that Obama needs to do an executive order, ladies and gentlemen. This is the problem if you are going to an election. Parties need to look strong, they need to look powerful, and that's why what they do is that they attempted to do move just to be oppositional to the other party, just to show strong, rather than focusing on solving the crisis itself. What are the problems here? It means that when we have new policy, like we want the president, for example, from a party, want to pass a new head of the central bank that they consider to be much better, it is likely that these parties will simply block that move just under the reason that that person doesn't come from their party. This is what the Republican is doing. This is the same thing that can happen again and again. That's the problem of going with election, ladies and gentlemen, on how the wrong people is the one that can pass. These are the kind of politics that it will become. Let's move, therefore, to the direct comparison with closing government, right? How will the people vote in such circumstances? all the time, because there are people in government that you don't vote. You don't vote the head of the central bank. You don't vote generals despite them making important decisions. So choice is a means to an end, right? And that end is societal betterment. And that is only given when it is necessary. So the key question, therefore, becomes our contribution on how exactly will people vote and why that vote will be detrimental. Number one, it is likely that these people will simply buy the rhetoric of the wrong government, right? Because when the government is focused on just one school of thought, it is easy for them to make the wrong narratives about it. It is easy for them to make political propaganda. Austerity, for example, will be seen as taking away your job and taking away all the societal benefit. And this is catchy for the people. It's something that's interesting for them at the end of the day. That's why the wrong government can go in power. Secondly, it is easy for the people to fall into the temptation of wanting to blame someone. This is because these people think that this crisis is the result of one person, even though it might be a result of a much more structural problem. And that's why there's an incentive and a desire for them to blame someone. That's what happened in Greece as well. They just to blame Syriza, and that's why the more populist party eventually rises up under the populism wave, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we think that choice can be limited in this aspect, because the people does not have the rationality to really determine on whether or not this is just a blame move, and they also do not have the capability to be sure on whether or not what is currently being sold as an economic plan by their government is simply a propaganda or not. What is our comparative? In our side, at least when parties are secure in their power, there's a greater opportunity for them to compromise, because their power, their seats are not on the line. They are more willing to compromise and make decisions that's actually beneficial for the country, rather than focusing on winning election and blocking move just to win at the end of the day. So finally, why is this contribution much more important than opening opposition contribution? Number one, we analyze the structural reasons why the economy failed. We prove to you that the solution is not simplistic and one school of thought, but multiple school of thought, and you need to have the ability to pick and cherry pick the best of all worlds. Secondly, we talk about how election work, and this is something missing in this debate. We talk about how the people will react and how the politicians, the parties will react under election, and why the government that's created will simply be much worse. We proudly oppose.
Inviting to either wish for hands, we will come to deliberate and debate resolve and we announce the report. Thank you.